This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. Joining me today on Zoom, I have Dr. Mark Griffin of San Francisco State University. Good morning. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for asking me, Gabby. Asking me to come to join you. That this is a real privilege.
I'm really excited to have you on. I feel like I think my second episode was with Cynthia Wilczak.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Back in the day, so it feels like we're coming home in more ways than one because we're both in the Bay, so that's really nice. You specialize in teeth, and you are not the first tooth person that I have had on the show. But one of the things that I like to ask teeth people is like, why teeth? Why did you decide that you wanted to study teeth? How did you end up here looking into people's mouths?
That is something that frequently does come up when I'm talking to grad students and trying to get them focused on a topic. And I think my answer is hilarious. They think it's a lot less hilarious, but I think it does. I think it provides an interesting lesson in how the scientific method actually should be done and actually usually is done. Okay, so the brutal honest truth is that when I started grad school at Northern Illinois University, I was a late ad. I started in the spring semester, which is unusual. If you're familiar with grad school, that's not something that's usually done. I met Clark Larson at an excavation in northern Florida, and Clark and I were roommates, which makes for a weird setup for your future advisor. But okay, that's a whole different story. And our time at Amelia Island, Clark sort of got in my head and said, "Hey, Mark, why don't you?" Because I was a grad student at Florida State University at the time. In our time in the excavation, Clark said, "Why don't you bail on this whole Florida State thing and come work with me at Northern Illinois?" And you know, being young and impulsive and probably impressionable, I said, "Yeah, sure, why not? I will pick up from Florida and move to." For folks that don't know, Northern Illinois is in DeKalb. It's about 60 miles to the west of Chicago. So moving to DeKalb, Illinois in January from Florida is probably the most stupid idea that you could ever come up with. But okay, getting around to your actual question, when I joined the Amelia Island project, every other topic was taken. So when I sat down with Clark to decide what my thesis topic was going to be, he was brutally honest. He said, all of the good stuff's already taken. You're going to have to figure out how to carve a way into this project. And I had an interest in these things called non-metric traits, which lots of biological anthropologists were very skeptical of at the time. And okay, not to get too technical, but non-metric traits, they're just the shapes on your teeth. So if you yawn in the mirror and you take a look at the cusp patterns, the way that your teeth look, that's a non-metric trait. But I kind of floated that by, and he said, "Yeah, that'd be great. Let's do that." Like many young decisions, I knew nothing about teeth other than they were in your mouth. I knew absolutely nothing about non-metric dental traits. That was a whole foreign territory for me. So, okay, the long-winded, but you deal with academics, so you're used to this. The long-winded way of getting around, it was just complete serendipity. It's not that I had any interest in teeth. In fact, over the years, I think you develop a love-hate with teeth because they're weird things. Nobody likes them. Students hate to learn about them. It's a weird thing. But the interesting thing now, all these years later, that I find about teeth is that if you're willing to put in the time and the effort, you can find some really interesting things. That is my eventual sales pitch to students that I'm trying to convince to join me with taking a look at dental anatomy. Some of them buy it, some of them don't.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's so. it wasn't some sort of long dream of mine. The teeth were probably the furthest thing from my mind when I was learning osteology in undergraduate school, because nobody liked teeth. Nobody looked at teeth. And the only thing that people talked about with teeth were, hey, sometimes they get rotten and fall out. Oh, okay. Well, how interesting is that?
It's funny because you are the second person I've interviewed this year who was like, I didn't really think I was going to do teeth until I was doing teeth. Also, fun fact, I interviewed Dr. Larson a few weeks ago.
Okay, yeah.
So what a great person to end up with if you are doing teeth.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, if you're going to end up with somebody, if you're going to end up with the leftover thesis project, might as well be with the person that knows what they're doing.
Yep.
So yeah, serendipity indeed.
Mm-hmm. And I can actually also, having talked to Dr. Larson, totally see him being like, yeah, just move to Florida and come to Northern Illinois. It'll be great. I can totally
Yeah.
see him doing that.
Yep. But you know what? Clark and I have known each other for a very long time, so he will, I think, probably appreciate this observation. Since my first encounter with Clark was in a field situation, and we were literally sharing a bedroom with one another and a bathroom, my relationship with my advisor is completely different from any of the other students. And I think to the good. I think we could have conversations that maybe other students couldn't have, and I found that to be very productive. And yeah.
Yeah, he's an incredibly kind person, which I think helps a lot,
Yes, absolutely.
especially when you're in grad school.
Yeah.
So, since you mentioned the Amelia Island project, can you just talk a little bit about what that is, just so we have a little bit of closure?
Clark and fellow researchers, David Hurst Thomas at the American Museum of Natural History, I had a long running project, the Santa Catalina Diwali project, doing excavations and research on Spanish missions up and down the East Coast. And the Amelia Island project was not the final one, but one of the capstone projects from that series of mission excavations. So it was a Spanish mission from the later. It's the one of the last of the Spanish missions before the Spanish were driven out by the English, and so it was a very interesting time period for cultural change. I say that guardedly because the changes that we talk about euphemistically were, of course, devastating for Native American populations. But from a bioarchaeological point of view, that meant there was a lot going on for researchers to take a look at. So it's sort of a interesting series of projects, to get in on.
That's really cool. I also, my folks live in Florida, and I go camping on Cumberland Island, which you can
Hmm.
almost see
Right.
Amelia Island from Cumberland.
Right.
If I have any listeners who are really into camping and really into like ecology, Cumberland Island is one of like the best places in the United States to camp.
Right.
But maybe I'll do a little swing through Amelia Island next time I'm out there.
And not to go too far astray, but it was an odd juxtaposition for archaeologists, because we were staying in this very posh condo, and then getting up and doing excavations on something completely different on a daily basis. So it's as if you were jumping back and forth in time and space every single day. It was in some ways it was jarring. I have pictures from because a lot of the preliminary or lab work that we did for the project, we did on the fancy glass table in the dining room of the condo. And I have these bizarre pictures of us doing osteological analysis in this very bizarre kind of environment. But anyway, it was an interesting project with interesting results.
So one of your interests that came when you decided that you were going to do teeth is you're really interested in caries. Can you tell us what a carie is?
Yeah, and not to throw you off track, but just to sort of follow up and put this in context. Another complete accident. complete serendipity. For my early work, there were already folks at Northern Illinois that were doing analysis on caries, the things that your dentist calls cavities in your teeth. And so that wasn't what I was doing for years. In fact, when I took the job at San Francisco State 26 years ago, I was carrying on taking a look at tooth morphology, and my intention was to carry forward with that research. And when you begin doing archaeological research in California, one of the things that you find very quickly is that the amount of wear on the teeth for pre-contact Native American populations in California it's just mind-bending how much wear there is. And for those who, for folks that are trying to imagine what I'm talking about, if you look in the mirror and take a look at your teeth and the pearly part, the enamel part, that is completely gone for most individuals that you're looking at in pre-contact California Native American populations. By the time you're 30 or 35, all of the enamel's gone because the wear is so extreme. And the point I'm getting to is the thing that I had done for decades at that point just simply wasn't even a possibility when I got to California. So my intention, actually, the whole point of the job when I was hired, they were very explicit with me that you will be doing California archaeology. And I say, yeah, sure, I can do California archaeology. Yeah, you can do archaeology anywhere, right? Not having done any research, just splashing in. And then I started, sitting down and taking a look, and I'm like, well, I can't do what I've been doing for years. I'm gonna have to do something else. And a point that I try to make with my grad students is this is one of those points in your research where you have to kind of take a step back and do basic science. And the basic science that I started doing was, instead of trying to come up with some crazy hypothesis that I thought was a good idea, I just started collecting data. That sounds kind of cold and clinical. I started making observations on teeth, everything that I could possibly observe, and start keeping track of things. So for probably the first 10 years that I was at San Francisco State, and this sounds not particularly productive, I really didn't have a direction. It wasn't until much, much later that, I started recognizing patterns. And I know this wasn't your question, and I'm realizing now I've gone way off track.
No, it's
But
okay.
back to your question, which I think I remember, the thing that I eventually settled on in terms of focusing my attention is the pathological processes that can happen in your mouth. The holes in the teeth, the carious lesions, as we call them, or cavities that your dentist calls them, just happens to be one of them. But some of the other ones, most people are perfectly familiar with as well. One of the things that we spend a lot of time taking a look at is periodontal disease. That's the thing that your dentist constantly, you know, stays on you about. Floss your teeth. Otherwise, you'll get gingivitis. Your gums are bleeding. Why are they bleeding? Are you not flossing? So we spend a lot of time taking a look at that, as well as some other related things that we can kind of collectively put into oral pathology. But turns out they have very different origins. We call them etiologies. They have very different etiologies from one another. That's one of the interesting outcomes of my current research. Is it's very easy to take a look at different pathological conditions in the mouth and saying, well, these people had really poor health. But as we've begun to actually refine that, that's really a misguided interpretation. And I'll be quiet for a minute or two, because I
No,
see you're thinking, wow,
yeah,
he's
no.
going way off he's off the map now.
No, I'm thinking I have a lot more questions.
Okay.
I have a feeling that this interview, it's one of those things where it's like we're just going to keep feeding off of each other. No, so I think that there's a lot of different questions here. First, one of the things that I'm getting from your research and from what you're saying is that the potential origins of these periodontal disease, like, or cavities or whatever, any kind of pathological changes to the mouth, you're thinking that they're not what normal people think about when they think about things that cause it. So, like, for example, I think that when most people think about things that cause cavities, they're like sugar
Right.
or
Right.
not brushing your teeth,
Right.
or so what kind of things are you finding instead, or is that a part of it, or what's going on there?
So, that brings up a whole bunch of related issues. I would say that, and I hope, no, I'm pretty sure that I'm not alone in this. I've talked with some of my fellow bioarchaeologists, and their reaction to some of the things that I've written is, yeah, I've thought that for a long time. I just haven't been able to quite put my finger on it. And the thing that I'm dancing around here is that I know that we give a lot of voice now in the social sciences to making sure that the indigenous perspective or the Native American perspective comes through in our work. And what I find is that a lot of my colleagues seem to be giving some lip service to that, but there's not a whole lot of follow through. And the thing that I'm sort of working my way around to is I think I've gotten to a point where a lot of the things that I learned and read about for the last 30 or 40 years, I'm looking at and saying, we're looking at this completely the wrong way around. We have this, and it's how I think most of us had our cultural training. Most of us look at things like cavities in the teeth, and we think, oh, well, you have a disease. We're going to have to cure that. And taking a look at the current clinical research, things that are happening, with dentists, you know, taking a look at what's happening with their patients, one of the things that becomes very clear is that that kind of Western view of looking at, well, okay, we have folks that are diseased and we have folks that are not diseased. That sort of dichotomous view really doesn't give the full picture of what's going on. And I think most people are familiar, at least in passing, with some of the research that this is a small part of. And the thing that I'm talking about is microbiome research. One of the things that has become very apparent across the entire medical field in the last at least 10 years, maybe more, is that a lot of these things that we have classified as disease processes, we've really sort of misunderstood exactly what's going on. And specifically in terms of your oral cavity, I'm talking about your mouth and associated areas. I tell my students this, and you can see, first of all, their first reaction is they don't believe me. And then, second of all, when they, because now everybody brings a computer to class, and when they do the quick Wikipedia search, they're like, "Oh, wait, no, he's right." And then the look of disbelief turns into a look of horror. So when I tell folks that in the normal mouth, every individual has about 1,200 different species of microorganisms living in there in a community. That's just the normal habitat of the mouth. In fact, if we take a look at virtually every other part of your body, virtually every other part of your body also has a microbiome community. And when I say community, I think that really does emphasize one of the important things, which is those microorganisms. They're not, we like to think of them, well, okay, there's microorganisms that make you sick, and there's microorganisms that are beneficial to you. And again, not to get too philosophical on it, but that really sort of reminds me of our sort of capitalistic mindset that it's either good or it's bad. As it turns out, lots of the microorganisms that are living in your body are just part of the community. They're neither good nor bad. They're a classification that we call commensal, which means that they're just living there. And I forget who the author is, but there's a study from the world of dentistry that it had the best title. I wish I could steal it. they titled it The Mobile Microbiome. And what they were referring to is you, a human, you are a mobile microbiome. 90% of the cells in your body are not you. They're actually, they're microorganisms. So it's, you know, I always think about this, that when I talk about things that happen in the microbiome, I think of that, and I'm butchering this. There's a disturbance in the force. When we talk about things not going well, or going not in your favor, it really is a disruption in that microbiome. And this actually goes across the entire medical field now. When we talk about things, and I told you before the interview that I would tell you when I'm off the map and out of my expertise. So here it is. So I might say something that's wrong, and a doctor can, actual doctor can correct me on this. But my understanding of things like urinary tract infections, for instance, what I have seen thus far in the literature is that it's the same kind of thing. It's not that you've had an invasion of microorganisms that are doing you harm. It's that there's been a disturbance in your microbiome that has actually caused a lot of your commensal bacteria to be overwhelmed by pathologic bacteria.
Yeah.
And we're all familiar with that, the brouhaha that some folks missed a number of years ago with hand sanitizers. That was the reason why there was a switch in hand sanitizers, because doctors began realizing, wait, if we wipe out all the commensal bacteria on your hands, all that does is advantages all the pathogenic ones. Well, let's don't do that anymore. And so that whole litany of chemicals that were used to be in hand sanitizers, most of those have gone by the wayside in favor of things that are a bit more benign to, some of your native bacteria.
Huh.
And once again, I've kind of ventured far afield and forgotten where we started. But
no, I was asking about like, how do caries form? Because I was asking about how people like typically think about the causes of caries, and how a lot of times we're thinking about sugar, not brushing your teeth, not flossing. And I know there's been quite a bit of research in the biological anthropology space where people have tracked like an increase in the number of carious lesions or antemortem tooth loss with things like widespread agriculture,
right,
increased access to carbs that ferment in your mouth and feed all of these bacteria.
Okay, well, let's circle back and actually answer or I should circle back and actually answer your question. So what we've found in our research and it's not just California populations. I've duplicated the same thing in populations in the Southeast US. So it's not just an isolated phenomenon. What my research actually seems to suggest is that it's not the addition of a particular food item that precipitates increases in things like carious lesions, but rather it's the subtraction of other things that were there before.
Mm.
And one of the things that anthropologists have been fascinated about for the last more than 100 years is the transition from one subsistence system to another. The one that anthropologists seem to be really fascinated with is the transition to agriculture from hunting and gathering. And that folks that have taken classes with me before, when that topic comes up in the class, you can almost see them, the look on their face of, oh no, that person didn't know what they didn't know the question they were asking, and we're in for a lecture now.
I'm just gonna hop in real quick just to say, just in case you don't know what subsistence means, it's basically like how you go about getting food to live.
Sorry about that.
That's what subsistence is. No, you're totally fine. It's one of those things where I never know who's listening, and sometimes I forget, and I like let stuff get like very high level, and then I'm like, oh, but maybe it would be good to do it like for beginners again.
Right. Yeah. Same thing. I start slipping off into the technical stuff, and then I'm like, and you'll see that hand timidly coming up in the back of the room. What does subsistence system? So this fascination with a transition to agriculture, you can trace that back, of course, to lots of different places. One of the folks that it's really fun to blame is Australian archaeologist by the name of V. Gordon Child. For anthropologists that have seen this or heard this before, maybe you won't recognize the name, but you'll recognize the thing that he created, the Neolithic Revolution. In Child's mind, as well as lots of other anthropologists, the adoption of agriculture as a means to feed yourself was such a phenomenal occurrence that they spent, of course, entire careers taking a look at that. And certainly in places in the world where monoculture, the raising of one single crop like corn or wheat or barley, certainly in the places in the world where that was adopted, it did have a profound effect on populations. But the idea that there is some sort of intrinsic need to transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, the research that folks have been doing for the last 20 years shows that that's not really a thing. And in fact, when you take a look at, and again, it's not isolated to California, when you take a look at pre-contact native populations like the ones that you find in California, what you find is a way of making a living, a way of getting your food that doesn't fit neatly into any of our categories. It's not agriculture, but it's not hunting and gathering either. We have this sort of notion, we teach it in anthropology classes all the time of, well, hunting and gathering, that's a migratory existence. You're nomadic, you move from place to place. You eat wild animals and you consume wild plants. But then you get to a place like California and you start looking and you're like, okay, I don't know what that is. I'm talking esoterically, so let me talk a little less esoterically. That one of the things that California archaeologists learn at some point is, wow, native populations, they eat a lot of acorns, which for anybody that's actually put an acorn in their mouth or, tried those things, that your reaction might be, ew. But acorn consumption was a huge part of the dietary regime. And it's easy to look at that and say, yeah, I drive down, Interstate 280 or any of the other major corridors in California. There's oak trees everywhere. I've got an oak tree in my backyard. They're just a part of the natural environment. But then when you start doing the archaeology, you begin to realize, wait a minute, hold on. These landscapes that we look at, that we assume are natural, the fact that you've got these huge areas cleared out around oak trees. One of the things that California archaeologists, I always have beginning archaeologists that eventually I ask, why? Why are we recording this weird stuff called fire cracked rock? Who cares? What does that even mean? And why do we, when we take a look at these California sites, why does it look like everything was just burned? And eventually you get around to the explanation of, well, on an annual basis, what the local populations did was they burned off all the underbrush. What, modernly we would call it a controlled burn. It was a controlled burn for the express purpose of pushing all of that stuff down so that the oak trees would actually propagate and produce more and not have competition. So, back to my original, point, can we call that agriculture? Well, it's not as if people were necessarily planting the oak trees. They were letting, in that sense, nature take its course. On the other hand, oak trees need a little bit of help. Something that I talk about in my intro class is a famous scientist, a French scientist that everybody learns about in science classes called Comte Buffon. And the phrase that we learn about Buffon is that all living things go through a struggle for existence. In fact, there's a famous painting in the Paris Museum of Natural History of two lions that are at each other's throats, ripping each other's throats out. And, everybody likes to, there it is, struggle for existence. But when you read Buffon, and I know you're thinking, wow, this really went off the rails. And when you read Buffon, you have a bizarre encounter, which is Buffon wasn't talking about lions. He wasn't talking about creatures fighting with one another. He was pondering why it was so hard for him to establish a grove of oaks in the back of his property. And when he went out there and looked, he realized those darn squirrels do this weird behavior of collecting the acorns. We know that part, and burying them. But they also do this weird thing to the end of them. They chew the ends off of the acorns, which keeps them from propagating. It keeps them from turning into an oak tree, and then they'll have food next year. So in changing this landscape, it's not just burning off of the brush, it's also, sort of deterring those other creatures, because crows do the same thing, ravens do the same thing. And if you kind of tamp down some of that activity, some of those acorns that hit the ground won't be stored by all of those creatures, but will actually turn into an oak tree. So if you, follow the breadcrumbs back, is that agriculture? Well, I mean, not in the sense that we think. Is it hunting and gathering? Well, that's not part of any hunting and gathering that most anthropology students learn about. So what do you call that? I've coined a term that nobody's going to adopt, so I'll just live with that. I call it tending and foraging. You're actually helping the natural world along, or you're picking out. I mean, in the same sense that agriculturalists, pick a crop and then help it along. Our local populations were simply, focusing on those specific items that they wanted to actually, benefit. And getting back to, I know I'm off the rails again. Getting back to one of your questions. So when we take a look at California populations, it's not so much about what you're adding to the diet that changes the microbiome in your mouth. It's the things that you're subtracting from your diet. As it happens, the inclusion of things like acorns and using willow bark, for instance, to create baskets, and including things like buckeyes and natural berries in the diet, all of those things have a suppressive effect on the pathological species that can live in your mouth. And when you have, for instance, when you have the Spanish swooping in and forcing the local populations to abandon all of those food items, that's when you see levels of caries going through the roof. And in fact, you can duplicate the same thing in the American Southeast with the Spanish missions that are pulling native populations and concentrating them in the mission system. The Spanish became very, very fascinated with corn, but they looked at the native way of preparing the corn and they said, no. That's not something that we're going to buy into. And the native way of dealing with corn was to soak it into a mush and combine it with ashes that they had collected from burning oyster shells. That process, it's called liming. That process actually changes the pH of that porridge. So if you consume that, you don't have the high sugar content because that actually suppresses the pathologic species. So when the Spanish come in and they say, no, that crazy liming process that you guys do with the corn, we're done with that. You guys are going to fix corn the way that we want to fix corn, which is pretty much the way that they fixed wheat, which is take it, grind it, make bread out of it, and none of that other stuff. Well, when you take a look at the caries levels, for instance, the frequencies in native populations, well, no surprise. Guess what? The caries level go through the roof when the Spanish show up, because, and it's not just a matter of changing the way that you prepare the corn. It's also removing all of those other things. If folks that live in California know what a buckeye is, and you look at it and you're like, okay, first of all, I'm not eating that. And second of all, if you do taste it, your next reaction is, I am never touching that mess again.
So a buckeye is like a big old nut.
Yes.
People in Ohio will probably be familiar because of the buckeyes.
Exactly.
Previous to me moving out here, the only buckeye I was familiar with was the little chocolate with the peanut butter stuffed inside,
right.
which are delicious.
Right.
but not what we're
Yeah,
talking
not what we're
about.
talking about. But like a lot of things in life, it's an acquired taste, right?
Hmm.
And a large classification of the kind of compounds that I'm alluding to that changes the chemistry in your mouth are things that most people are familiar with, things that you would call tannins, tannic acid, that stuff that makes your mouth pucker when you drink red wine.
Yep. Or if you want a great example, it's in tea.
Sure.
That's the other thing that makes
Exactly.
the tea. And it's also what stains your teeth
Exactly.
brown when you go to the dentist and then they judge you.
Well, they can judge you all they want, but you can remind your dentist that I'm actually changing my mouth chemistry to the good, because the primary bacteria that causes carious lesions, the cavities in your teeth, is Streptococcus. And Streptococcus cannot thrive in an environment that you keep throwing tannic acid into. That actually suppresses their activity.
Huh.
In fact, that's one of the ways that I came across this sort of interesting direction in research is, if you take a look at dentists from the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese and other Asian dentists, they've been experimenting with these compounds. It's funny that you bring up tea, because tea is actually one of the predominant compounds they've been experimenting with, and for good reason, because most dentists have sort of a love-hate relationship with fluoride, because yes, fluoride does suppress that activity, but also has the potential of creating all sorts of other issues. And in fact, in populations where folks went a little overboard with fluoride, dentists gave up on that a long time ago and started looking at these other natural compounds as alternatives, because, well, they don't create a lot of the havoc that these artificial compounds that we come up with do.
To be clear, your fluoridated water is fine to
Oh,
drink.
absolutely. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Don't give that stuff up. But like all things in life, too much of a good thing is too much.
Yeah, living in the Bay Area, I'm sure you're familiar with this. For example, I had the handyman in my building came over, and when he found out I was drinking tap water, which we have great water here in the
Right.
Bay, he was like, "You know that they fluoridate that, right?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Do you know what that does to your pineal gland?" And I was like, "Nothing, because it calcified as normal." And that was not the right answer. That was not the right answer. But anyway, just in case anyone's listening, if you want to know more about fluoridation, please actually don't email me about this, because it really stresses me out. But there are quite a few scientific resources to talk about fluoridation.
Right.
And you're right. Too much of anything is bad for you, but I'm sorry, I'm harping on this. The amount of fluoride we have in our water system is okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a fair point. This is one of the things that we do try to caution our students about is, okay, you need to do a lot of reading and not just the sort of some of the reactionary literature, getting a little piece of something and then going
If you're reading something and it's amping
right.
you up, then it's probably something that needs at least like 2 or 3 second
Right.
looks at, and see if it's like, what is their motivation behind trying to get you amped up.
Right.
Most academic literature, even if it's an interesting topic, is not going to get you angry
That's generally true.
unless you're like also an academic and you're but that's
Right.
different. Like for the regular folks, it's not something that should be making you like
Right.
upset. So anyway,
No,
sorry.
yeah, no worries.
Continue. Science communication.
So one of the things that I think is really important to highlight is, as a scientist, I think lots of folks come away with the impression that we sit in our offices and we come up with these grand ideas. And I really want to highlight the serendipity of it all, because my current direction of research with the microbiome and with these compounds that we call karyostatic, because they suppress the caries activity, all of this started completely by serendipity. I went off on sabbatical, well, a little over 10 years ago. And my intention on that sabbatical was to test a hypothesis that I didn't come up with. This other folks had come up with this idea in California archaeology, looking at the things that I pointed out, the fact that Well, okay, one of the things I pointed out, I neglected to point out a really important point for California archaeology, but the point that I made about the excessive, that just the extreme wear on the teeth, looking at that extreme wear, but also looking at the levels of caries, the levels of caries in California really are just remarkably unusual in terms of how few there really are. And a hypothesis that was a favorite for lots of bioarchaeologists was, well, the answer is obvious, right? It's sort of natural tooth cleaning. If you're wearing your teeth down that aggressively, then the bacteria just doesn't have a chance to take over. And I read about that hypothesis, and I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. And I was working on an excavation from the Brentwood area, from a mortuary site dating to around 8,000 years ago, with a really large cemetery sample. So I thought I had the perfect test for this hypothesis. So I went off on my sabbatical. I crunched all the numbers, and the first time I crunched them, it just the test of the hypothesis, it failed so spectacularly that I looked at it and I'm like, wow, I had to have done something wrong there. And so I did them again, and it failed even more spectacularly. And I kept doing it, and it kept just failing. There was, and to get to the point, there was not only no correlation between levels of wear and frequencies of caries, it was almost as if it was sort of going in the opposite direction. I came back from my sabbatical, and I was lamenting to my colleagues, and of course, my colleagues in anthropology just sort of rolled their eyes and whatever. But folks that are familiar with anthropology and museums and such will recognize the acronym NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which specifies that federally funded organizations have to account for any Native American grave remains that they may have in their possession. And I am getting to a point here. We had a lab where we have a lab that is specifically focused on NAGPRA at San Francisco State. And we have Native American representatives that work in the lab. And I had made friends with one of those folks, Kathy Wallace. And I mean, I was interested in, striking up a relationship with Kathy, yeah, because she's Native American, but also very importantly, because she was very grandmotherly. So when you needed a shoulder to cry on, you could go have lunch with Kathy, and she would listen to you and commiserate with you. So anyway, when I came back from this very depressing sabbatical, I sat down with Kathy. Oh, Kathy, this is the worst sabbatical ever. This went awful. I don't even have anything that I can publish on. My results just really were crap. And Kathy listened to me very patiently, and she looked at me after I was done, whining about my failed research. And she had this kind of special look in her eye when she was getting ready to tell you something profound. And she turned and she said, Mark, you know that we use willow bark, right? And I'm like, yeah, I know you use willow bark for baskets. And she could tell I wasn't following. So she, brought it down to the 3-year-old level for me, which is what I needed. And she said, so we use willow bark for everything. Like, okay, well, yeah, I kind of know that. And then she could see it still wasn't getting it. She said, we use willow bark for everything. So if you have a sore throat, you get willow bark tea. If you have a sore tooth, you get willow bark tea. If you're having a bad day, you get willow bark tea. And I'm like, with you with all of that, I'm not sure where this is going. And then so finally she just gave up and gave it to me. She said, you know what the major components in all of those things is salicylic acid. And I'm like, no, I didn't know that. And for those of you that they're thinking, what in the world is that's aspirin? That's the major component to aspirin. Willow bark has well, okay, that's where aspirin comes from originally. The salicylic acid is, of course, a pain reliever and also an analgesic. It reduces inflammation. And as it happens, it's also a powerful anti-caries compound. It wipes out Streptococcus species like nobody's business. And that actually that's the thing that started the entire research process I went off and I started doing the research in the clinical literature, and I'm like, oh my God, there's actually dentists modernly that are using salicylic acid to depress caries. And here we have something that was so ubiquitous in the California Native American, lifeways, livelihood. It permeated everything. And I think that comes full circle to something that I tried to make a point of at the outset, which is one of the things that I think anthropologists have been neglectful of is allowing the populations that we're trying to study, allowing them to have the agency. Because one of the points that Kathy Wallace made to me repeatedly was, for instance, one of the ideas that California archaeologists love to put out there about, well, the teeth are so worn because they used grinding stones to grind the acorns, and some of that grit got off into the flour. And I ran that by Kathy, and she looked at me and she said, "So you think we're not smart enough to realize that if we're crunching on something in our flour, that we would stop doing what's causing that?" And I paused and I thought, I'm like, yeah, okay, that explanation may be a little bit lacking. But she also pointed out to me that because I think initially I was thinking, oh, so this correspondence of karyostatic activity and making baskets and tea and all of these other things, it's just sort of almost a happenstance. But I gradually began to realize this was on purpose. It's not as if the native communities didn't know what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. And so a lot of these food items that I think Westerners look at and they're like, oh, why would you eat that? The explanation I've heard from lots of anthropologists is, well, you didn't have any other choice. There's not a whole lot of options out here. You're going to have to eat the things that you got available, rather than taking the viewpoint of maybe they actually knew what they were doing, that there's actually intentionality here of choosing those food items.
So wait, so where does the wear come from?
Oh, I did neglect to point that out. I've actually woven that in and forgot to highlight it. It's exactly from the thing that I've mentioned a number of times. It's the basket making. And I would love to take credit for this, but I won't because I didn't come up with this. The two folks that have to be credited for this is a graduate student from San Jose State, Dave Grant. Dave Grant is the one that clued me into this, and the one that actually put all the pieces together for both of us was the Native American representative for the excavation that we were both working on, Ramona Garibay. Ramona was spending time with us in the lab, and Dave and I were both looking at the wear on the teeth, and we're like, "This is the craziest thing we've ever seen. We've never seen just the amount of wear, the type of wear, and what's with all these crazy grooves in the teeth." And again, Ramona was sitting there. Ramona is a native artisan amongst other things, and one of the things that she specializes in is making soap root brushes. She was working on a soap root brush, and she kind of looked over her reading glasses at us as we sat there. She probably let us go on for 45 minutes or more, and then finally she looked over her glasses and she said, "You're looking at splitting teeth." And we both stopped and we're like, "We're looking at what?" And she said, when you split the willow bark to make a basket, you have to split it into quarters so that it actually curls around the proper way to make a basket. The best way to do it is to grab it between two or three of your teeth and pull it through your teeth. And when you do that over a lifetime, it actually wears your teeth down. And in fact, when you take a look at all of the various things, the making of arrows out of willow, not willow bark, but willow wood, all of those things, the houses were made out of willow bark, all of those activities, all of that is producing that super excessive wear on the teeth. And the thing that Dave Grant realized was it's not ordinary wear. It's not just simply grinding the teeth down into flat little nubs. Dave was the thing. Dave was the person. And, frequently you have to rely on listening to your students so that you learn things. that you didn't know before. One would think that working with teeth, it might have occurred to me or a myriad of other bioarchaeologists to actually take the two parts of the dentition, the maxilla, the upper part, and the mandible, the lower part, and put them together to see what they look like together. But when you're collecting data on teeth, it's normal to take them apart and look at look at the tops of the teeth and never put them together. And Dave was the one that pointed out to me. He said, "Come over here, look at this." And he put the two dentitions together, the upper and the lower, and they didn't fit. The teeth didn't touch one another. In fact, you could see these giant grooves that were going through the dentitions. And the first time that you actually see that, you realize, whoa, this is something off the charts weird. And then we went through and we put all the dentitions together. None of them fit together. In fact, when you start taking a look across at every single site in California, every single site has exactly the same thing. And the interesting thing is, this goes through thousands of years. This is not some one-off that happens in one group or one period of time. So the lion's share of the excessive wear has to do with manipulating all of these things that you're making, common everyday items, the baskets, the canoes, the houses, the arrows, the bows, every single component, you're using your teeth as tools. It's a process that we call non-alimentary, that is not having to do with your normal eating. It's called non-alimentary wear. And that's something that Dave wrote his master's thesis on. And as the name implies, he did a masterful job. I wish that more people would read that. It's just a wonder of a work. Dave wasn't, by the way, Dave wasn't my grad student. So I'm not waxing philosophical about one of my grad students. I was just bowled away by just the amount of insight that went into that. But going back, neither one of us would have ever made that connection if Ramona Garibay hadn't been sitting there and set us straight about what we were looking at, which again, I think does emphasize, it's not just a matter of representation. I mean, that's important, but it's a matter of inclusion, that it's absolutely essential. If we want to understand what we're really doing, we really need to have that kind of interaction with Native American representatives. I think in the Western world, I think we don't give enough credit to consulting elders. Okay, we don't need to get off into the political, but there's this sort of weird American thing that we don't give that kind of credit. And so when we're talking about consulting with Native American elders, it's not just a matter of, we should give respect to the elders of the community. They know a lot. They are walking encyclopedias, and including that in your research, I think, is just so vital. I wouldn't be doing anything that I'm currently doing without that input and insight. So I just thought, sorry, I went a little crazy with that, but I think that's so important to point out.
No, I think it's good. I feel like we've gotten a lot of very different things over the course of this interview. We've talked about caries, we've talked about different life ways, we've talked about, like, I think one of the main themes in your interview is kind of subverting expectations, which I think is cool. I will say that I want to be cognizant of your time, even though I know you don't have other things on Friday. I know you probably don't want to spend all day talking to me. So I wanted to ask you my final three questions. The first question is, if someone wanted to learn more about bioarchaeology and dental anthropology and, like, kind of your area of research in particular, is there a good place for them to start?
I see a lot of my colleagues doing this, and I'm always a little skeptical when I look at somebody's website and they've got all of their things that they published on there, and I'm like, yeah, okay, great, they're very impressive. But having said that, I published a chapter a number of years ago in a volume for bioarchaeology of the American Southeast, and I only mention this not to hype myself. I generally try to shy away from doing that, but my partner was actually the one this morning that pointed it out. I asked her because I knew you were going to ask me this question, and I said, so in terms of non-technical stuff, can I point anybody to anything that they could read? Because I'll be quite honest, I was so proud when I finished my PhD dissertation. I was so proud of it. I sent it to my mother. I sent a copy to my mother, who taught elementary education for 30 years. And then many years later, probably decades later, I said, "So, you did read my dissertation?" And she said, "I didn't understand a word of that. No, I didn't read that." Thanks for sending that. So anyway, my point being, I think that chapter that I have on the Southeast bioarchaeology, I think that's really accessible, and that is on my website, which, without giving this long URL, typing in Mark Griffin to the interweb, I know that makes me sound really old. It'll come up right away, and you'll go right to my website, and the publications are on there. And I have to say, I think I did a good job of explaining in that chapter without, getting too elementary about it. So I really would kind of recommend that. I think that's a really good one of my graduate students, and maybe he was pandering. That's possible. But not too long ago, he said, "I think you did a really good job in that chapter of explaining all of your major theories." And looking back on it, I think I did. I'll give myself a little credit on that one.
I will also recommend to people Ed Yong's I Contain Multitudes for kind of a super accessible pop science book on
Oh yeah, great, great,
microbiomes.
perfect.
That's I think probably like the most accessible version of microbiomes. Although there's another one, I can't remember what it's called, that I liked more, which I know is like sacrilegious to say in the SciComm community because everyone's like, I love Ed Yong and I love him too. But there's this other one that had like a really long chapter on toxoplasmosis. And I was like, this is the most interesting thing I've ever read. I'll see if I can remember what it's called and I'll put it in the show notes. Second question, what are you reading for work right now?
Okay, this is going to get off into the weeds. Although, if there are California bioarchaeologists listening to this, they'll just kind of nod their head like, "Yeah, yeah, fine, whatever." I have a graduate student that's doing a research project taking a look at growths in the ear that are called external auditory exostoses. That's a mouthful. And I have to admit that I was skeptical at the outset. I had a graduate student, and if she listens to this, I'm sorry, Gina, I didn't let you do this. I was wrong. I've had grad students that have brought this up and they said, everybody's talking about these external auditory exostoses. And the thinking is that if you expose your ears to cold water, like in surfing or kayaking or diving or any of those kind of activities, that you're predisposed to these things. And my reaction to that, folks telling me that, was, all right, find me the clinical literature that actually supports that, and I'll let you go to town with it. Well, the clinical literature actually finally got to a critical point, I would say, in the last 10 years, that the connection between cold water exposure and these little growths in your ear, which can actually grow to a point where they completely close off the ear canal, the connection is pretty solid now. And so I've been doing a whole lot of reading in the clinical literature of all of the things that folks have been writing about and researching in the clinical world, taking a look at this. And I have to say, this started off really as me getting familiar with the literature so that I could provide my grad student with some feedback on her thesis. And it sort of blossomed into an interest that will turn into a publication that we'll both do, because, it sort of caught my fascination. I'm like, wow, fair point. This is interesting stuff. And it actually connects with one of the things that I really harp on my grad students with, which is never to get into the bad habits that some bioarchaeologists do of simply staying in the bioarchaeological world, just talking about the skeletons, just talking about the skeletal research, because there is such a rich amount of literature and perspective and context that you get from the clinical world. Like, I keep mentioning, I read stuff from the dentistry world all the time, because, they're looking at living modern populations and in some cases experimenting. So I find it rich and fascinating literature, but also, informs what we should be looking at in a bioarchaeological sense.
Yeah. One of the things I say on the podcast a lot, sorry, longtime listeners, I think I say this every third episode, is that anthropology is truly the magpie's discipline
Yep,
where you can take a little bit from everywhere.
exactly.
And that's what makes it so special. Um, Third question is, what are you consuming for fun right now? So that can be like a book, podcast, TV show, hiking. I've gotten all kinds of answers over the years.
Okay. All of my students know this, so there's not going to be any kind of, confession that folks haven't heard before. My partner and I are avid consumers of the detective literature. Name an author, we've probably read it. And name somebody that has, and what our real kryptonite, as it were, is British detective series. So this is not a British detective series, but it's adjacent. There's a series called Cardinal, which is a police procedural, and I think our fascination, not to try to get too academic about it, but I think our fascination with it is that we're both scientists and we appreciate the science. Not the science and wow, that's really cool science, but rather in
Sorry.
the procedural aspect of putting the evidence together and chasing the evidence in various directions. I think that's the thing that we really appreciate about it. And I hate to say that the Brits are doing something better, but I think the Brits do it better.
The reason I'm smiling is because I'm literally halfway through MC
Okay.
Beaton's
Yep.
Agatha Raisin murder mystery series, which is great. Listeners, if you are into like British murder mysteries, like books or whatever, or any kind of cozy mysteries, there's actually a great website that I think it's called cozymysteries.com. It's got some kind of like very obvious name. It's called it's cozymystery.com. I was right. Which has a ton of great recommendations, but I'm halfway through. All my friends are pregnant. So I'm halfway through crocheting baby blankets, and I just put like Sister Boniface or Father Brown on in the background or Murders in Paradise. And I'm just sitting there like making a loving little baby blanket while watching people get murdered. And it's horrible, but it's so nice. It's so relaxing.
Right. It's great to just have a good story. I think I appreciate the storytelling.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, since I started crocheting so much, I've been watching more TV so that I can finish these blankets before the babies get here. But yes, totally with you on the British murder mystery series. Although I do wonder why so many feature the clergy so heavily. I'm not like against it, but it is just like a weird thing that I've noticed about them. Like, and it's not just Father Brown and Sister Boniface. It's also like Cadfael and like
Grantchester, you gotta love Grantchester.
yeah, yeah. It's just like a weird. That never. If I were to set out to write a murder mystery series, it probably would not feature a priest as the main mystery solver. But that's another mystery for me to solve. Is why?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. What's the
What's the
fascination?
deal? But it's cool. I'm totally fine with it. Anyway, on that note, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having me. Been fun.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound